1,229 years. That was the time it took to build the greatest empire humanity had ever witnessed. 2D cartoon animation. From a small village on the banks of the Tiber River, they expanded outward, conquering everything in their path. 2D cartoon animation. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west all the way to Syria in the east. 2D cartoon animation. They built roads, built bridges, built laws, laying the foundations for the entire Western civilization we know today. 2D cartoon animation. One day. That was all it took for everything to collapse. 1,200 years of construction. And just one day to end it all. 2D cartoon animation. But the strangest thing is not that the empire came to an end, for every empire must eventually fall. 2D cartoon animation. The strangest thing is that when it ended, when 1,000 years of history closed, no one there realized it at all. 2D cartoon animation. People still went to the market, still worked the fields, still paid their taxes, as if nothing had happened, as if the end of the world were just an ordinary day. 2D cartoon animation. How could a 1,000-year empire disappear without a sound? How could the apocalypse of the West pass in silence? 2D cartoon animation. The answer lies in one specific day, the 4th of September, 476, in a small city called Ravenna. 2D cartoon animation. But to understand that day, to understand why no one noticed, we must return to the golden age of the Roman Empire. 2D cartoon animation. So how did Rome rise to the very peak, only to fall into the abyss without anyone ever realizing it? 2D cartoon animation. 753 years before the Common Era. According to legend, a man named Romulus founded a small city on the banks of the Tiber. 2D cartoon animation. A tiny city-state, surrounded by enemies, with no reason to believe it would become anything more than a footnote in history. 2D cartoon animation. But Rome did not stay small. It conquered its neighbors one by one, absorbing their lands, their people, their strength. 2D cartoon animation. First, the Italian peninsula fell under Roman control. Then they looked beyond, across the Mediterranean Sea. 2D cartoon animation. Carthage, the great rival, was crushed after 3 brutal wars. The famous general Hannibal, who once terrified Rome, died in exile. 2D cartoon animation. Greece, the cradle of civilization, became a Roman province. Egypt, land of the pharaohs, bowed to Roman legions. 2D cartoon animation. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. 2D cartoon animation. In 27, before the Common Era, a man named Octavian became the first emperor. He took the title Augustus, meaning the revered 2D cartoon animation. Under Augustus, Rome entered what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. 200 years of unprecedented prosperity. 2D cartoon animation. They built roads connecting every corner of the empire. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was literally true. 2D cartoon animation. They built aqueducts carrying fresh water to cities. They built the Colosseum, temples, public baths, monuments that still stand today. 2D cartoon animation. Latin became the language of law, science, and literature. Roman law became the foundation of Western legal systems. 2D cartoon animation. The empire stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. 2D cartoon animation. Tens of millions of people lived under Roman rule. Dozens of emperors sat on the throne across generations. 2D cartoon animation. For centuries, Rome seemed eternal. The phrase "the eternal city" was not poetic exaggeration. People genuinely believed it. 2D cartoon animation, but nothing lasts forever. In 395 after the Common Era, Emperor Theodosius I died. 2D cartoon animation. 2D cartoon animation. His death split the empire in two. The eastern half centered on Constantinople, the western half eventually centered on Ravenna, 2D cartoon animation. The East would survive for another 1,000 years, becoming what we call the Byzantine Empire, 2D cartoon animation, but the West began to crumble. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, like a building whose foundations had rotted away. 2D cartoon animation. In 410, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under King Alaric. 2D cartoon animation. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army had breached the walls of Rome. The Eternal City was not so eternal after all. 2D cartoon animation. The Western Empire limped on, but the wounds kept multiplying. Territory was lost piece by piece. 2D cartoon animation. Britain was abandoned. Gaul was overrun. Spain fell to various Germanic tribes. 2D cartoon animation. The emperors became increasingly powerless, puppets controlled by military strongmen, many of whom were not even Roman. 2D cartoon animation. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was an empire in name only. It controlled little more than Italy itself. 2D cartoon animation. The glory of Rome, the empire that had ruled the known world, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. 2D cartoon animation. And lurking beneath the surface, a crisis was building that would bring everything crashing down. 2D cartoon animation. But the real problem was not the barbarians at the gates. The real problem was something far more fundamental. 2D cartoon animation. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The destruction was so thorough that we still use the word vandalism today. 2D cartoon animation. Yet, even after being sacked twice, the empire somehow continued to exist. The title of emperor still meant something, even if the power behind it was hollow. 2D cartoon animation. But here was the real problem, the one that would ultimately prove fatal. There were simply not enough Romans willing to serve in the army anymore. 2D cartoon animation. The population had declined due to wars, plagues, and economic hardship. Taxes were crushing, morale was low, and military service had lost its appeal. 2D cartoon animation. So who would defend the borders? Who would fight the endless waves of Germanic tribes pressing against the frontiers? 2D cartoon animation. The answer was both practical and dangerous. Rome began hiring the barbarians themselves to do the fighting. 2D cartoon animation. They called them Foederati, federated allies. Germanic warriors who fought for Rome in exchange for pay and promises of land. 2D cartoon animation. Heruli, Siri, Rugi, Tersilingi, tribes with names most Romans could barely pronounce, now forming the backbone of the Roman army. 2D cartoon animation. It seemed like a clever solution. Why waste Roman blood when you could pay others to die for you? 2D cartoon animation. But there was an obvious problem. When the people protecting you become stronger than you, who really holds the power? 2D cartoon animation. The Foederati knew their worth. Without them, the empire would collapse overnight, and they began to act accordingly. 2D cartoon animation. Now, let me introduce the two men whose collision would end an empire. 2D cartoon animation. The first is Odoacer, a Germanic warrior, probably from the Siri tribe, born around 433, 2D cartoon animation. He joined the Roman army as a young man and rose through the ranks. Capable, ambitious, respected by his fellow soldiers. 2D cartoon animation. Here is an interesting detail. His father was a man named Edico who once served in the court of Attila the Hun. 2D cartoon animation. Attila, the scourge of God. The man who had terrorized both halves of the Roman Empire just decades earlier. 2D cartoon animation. The second man is Orestes, a Roman from Pannonia, the region we now call Hungary. 2D cartoon animation. And here is where history gets strange. Orestes had also served Attila the Hun as his secretary and ambassador. 2D cartoon animation. Think about that for a moment. The father of one man and the other man himself had both served the most feared conqueror of their age. 2D cartoon animation. Now these two men, connected by Attila's shadow, would face each other to decide the fate of Rome. 2D cartoon animation. By 475, Orestes had risen to become Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers, the most powerful military position in the Western Empire. 2D cartoon animation. In that year, he led a coup against Emperor Julius Nepos. Nepos fled to Dalmatia and Orestes seized control. 2D cartoon animation. But Orestes did not make himself emperor. Instead, he placed his own son on the throne. 2D cartoon animation. On October 31st, 475, a teenager named Romulus Augustus became the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. 2D cartoon animation. The boy was perhaps 15 or 16 years old. A child on a throne, a puppet controlled entirely by his father. 2D cartoon animation. And his name, Romulus Augustus, carried an irony so heavy it seems almost deliberate. 2D cartoon animation. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus, the title of the first and greatest emperor. 2D cartoon animation. The boy who bore both names would be the last, but we will return to that irony later. 2D cartoon animation. For now, the situation was this: a child emperor, a powerful father pulling the strings, and an army of Germanic mercenaries waiting to be paid. 2D cartoon animation. The people of Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, refused to recognize Romulus. To them, Julius Nepos was still the legitimate emperor. 2D cartoon animation. They mocked the boy in the West, calling him Augustulus, Little Augustus. The Greeks called him Momulus, Little Disgrace. 2D cartoon animation. The Western Empire had shrunk to almost nothing. Just Italy and a sliver of Gaul. A pitiful remnant of former glory. 2D cartoon animation. And then the Foederati came to Orestes with a demand. They wanted land. 1/3 of Italy, to be precise. 2D cartoon animation. The Visigoths had received land in Gaul. The Burgundians had received land in Gaul. Why should they be any different? 2D cartoon animation. As the historian J.B. Berry wrote, they simply wanted what any soldier wants after years of service: roof trees and lands of their own. 2D cartoon animation. Orestes refused. He wanted to keep Italy intact, to protect the interests of the Roman landowners who supported him. 2D cartoon animation. The men who had bled for Rome, who had held the line while Romans stayed home, were denied their reward. 2D cartoon animation. They had had enough. The Foederati turned against Orestes and looked for someone to lead them. 2D cartoon animation. They found Odoacer. In August of 476, the Germanic troops proclaimed him as their king. 2D cartoon animation. And now Odoacer would come to collect what was owed. 2D cartoon animation. Odoacer marched south, gathering forces as he went. From garrisons across Italy, the Foederati flocked to his banner. 2D cartoon animation. His army numbered somewhere between 10 and 20,000 warriors. Not a massive force, but more than enough for what was to come. 2D cartoon animation. Orestes received word of the uprising and retreated to Pavia, a city with strong defensive walls. He hoped to wait out the storm. 2D cartoon animation. But there would be no waiting. Odoacer's forces surrounded Pavia and laid siege to the city. 2D cartoon animation. The walls that Orestes trusted proved useless. Pavia fell, and Orestes was captured. 2D cartoon animation. On August 28, 476, Orestes was taken to the city of Placentia. 2D cartoon animation. There, the man who had once served Attila, who had made his son emperor, was executed. His gamble had failed. 2D cartoon animation. The father, who had tried to secure power for his child, was now dead, but the child still sat on the throne in Ravenna. 2D cartoon animation. Orestes had a brother named Paulus who made one last attempt to save the dynasty. He gathered what loyal troops remained and marched out to meet Odoacer. 2D cartoon animation. The battle took place just outside Ravenna, near a place called the Pine Grove. It was not much of a battle. 2D cartoon animation. Paulus was killed. The last defender of Romulus Augustus was gone. 2D cartoon animation. September 2nd, 476. Odoacer stood before the gates of Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire. 2D cartoon animation. And here is where the story becomes strange. The final battle for Rome was not really a battle at all. 2D cartoon animation. It was, as one historian put it, quick and easy, almost anticlimactic 2D cartoon animation. There was no epic siege, no desperate last stand, no rivers of blood flowing through the streets. 2D cartoon animation. The simple truth was this. There was almost no one left to defend Ravenna. The Roman army had essentially ceased to exist. 2D cartoon animation. Most of the soldiers who might have defended the city were the very Foederati now standing with Odoacer. 2D cartoon animation. The men inside the walls looked at the men outside, and they saw their own brothers, cousins, former comrades. 2D cartoon animation. Why die for a child emperor that even Constantinople refused to recognize? Why die for an empire that had already abandoned them? 2D cartoon animation. Ravenna opened its gates. Odoacer walked in without significant resistance. 2D cartoon animation. September 4th, 476. The day that historians would later mark as the end of the Western Roman Empire. 2D cartoon animation. Odoacer entered the imperial palace and found Romulus Augustus waiting for him. A 16-year-old boy, alone, his father dead, his uncle dead. 2D cartoon animation. What happened next was not what anyone might have expected. Odoacer did not kill the boy. 2D cartoon animation. According to the ancient source known as Anonymous Valesianus, Odoacer was moved by the youth and beauty of Romulus. 2D cartoon animation. The Germanic warlord, the man who had just toppled an empire, looked at this child and felt something like pity. 2D cartoon animation. Romulus Augustus was formally deposed. He was made to remove the imperial purple to give up the crown. 2D cartoon animation. 1,229 years of Roman rule in the West ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. 2D cartoon animation. No great battle, no heroic last stand, just a boy handing over his crown to a barbarian king. 2D cartoon animation. But Odoacer went further. He did not merely spare the boy's life, he gave him a pension. 2D cartoon animation. 6,000 solidi per year. The annual income of a wealthy senator granted to the last emperor of Rome. 2D cartoon animation. Romulus was sent to live at the Castellum Lucullanum, a luxurious villa near Naples. 2D cartoon animation. The same villa where Emperor Tiberius had once vacationed centuries before, when Rome still ruled the world. 2D cartoon animation. The last emperor would live out his days in comfort. A pensioner of the man who had destroyed his empire. 2D cartoon animation. Some sources suggest he lived until 507 or even 511, more than 30 years after the fall. 2D cartoon animation. 30 years of watching the world change, knowing that he was the last of a line stretching back over a millennium. 2D cartoon animation. So that was it? 1,200 years? Finished just like that? 2D cartoon animation. 6,000 solidi. To put that in perspective, it was the kind of money that could buy estates, fund armies, live like royalty. 2D cartoon animation. The boy who lost an empire was given a retirement package that most Romans could only dream of. 2D cartoon animation. He would spend his remaining decades in a seaside villa, surrounded by servants, wanting for nothing material. 2D cartoon animation. But the ironies of this story run far deeper than a comfortable exile. 2D cartoon animation. After Romulus was deposed, the Roman Senate convened to discuss what should happen next. 2D cartoon animation. They sent ambassadors to Constantinople, carrying the imperial regalia, the purple robe, the diadem, the symbols of Western rule. 2D cartoon animation. Their message to Emperor Zeno was remarkable. They said the majesty of a single emperor was sufficient to rule both East and West. 2D cartoon animation. They were not begging for rescue. They were not calling for vengeance against the barbarian usurper. 2D cartoon animation. They were simply saying, "We do not need a Western emperor anymore. One ruler in Constantinople is enough." 2D cartoon animation. Think about what that means. The Romans themselves declared their own empire unnecessary. 2D cartoon animation. Odoacer took the title Rex Italiae, King of Italy, the first Germanic king to rule the Italian peninsula. 2D cartoon animation. But here is where it gets truly strange. Odoacer did not destroy the Roman system. He preserved it. 2D cartoon animation. Roman law continued to function. The courts still operated. Contracts were still enforced the same way they had been for centuries. 2D cartoon animation. The Roman administrative system remained intact. The same bureaucrats shuffled the same papers in the same offices. 2D cartoon animation. Odoacer even minted coins bearing the image of the Eastern Emperor. He acknowledged, at least nominally, Constantinople's supremacy. 2D cartoon animation. And the Senate? The ancient institution that had guided Rome since the days of the kings. 2D cartoon animation. The Senate was actually given more power under Odoacer than it had enjoyed in 200 years. 2D cartoon animation. For the first time in generations, the Senate was allowed to mint its own bronze coins, a privilege that had long been denied to them. 2D cartoon animation. Life for ordinary Italians continued almost unchanged. They paid their taxes to a different master, but they still paid taxes. 2D cartoon animation. They went to the same markets, farmed the same fields, worshipped in the same churches. 2D cartoon animation. This is why no one noticed the fall of Rome. Because in practical terms, very little actually fell. 2D cartoon animation. The empire did not collapse in fire and chaos, it simply transformed. The label changed, but the substance remained. 2D cartoon animation. This is the answer to the question we asked at the beginning. How does an empire vanish without anyone noticing? 2D cartoon animation. It vanishes when the change is so gradual, so subtle that the ending looks exactly like another ordinary day. 2D cartoon animation. But there is one final irony, the most poetic of them all. Look again at the name Romulus Augustus, 2D cartoon animation. Romulus, the mythical founder who built Rome from nothing in 753 before the Common Era, 2D cartoon animation. Augustus, the first emperor who transformed the Republic into an empire in 27 before the Common Era, 2D cartoon animation. Romulus Augustus, the last emperor, who watched it all end in 476 of the Common Era. 2D cartoon animation. The boy carried the names of both the beginning and the glory, and he became the symbol of the end. 2D cartoon animation. History, it seems, has a sense of poetry that no writer could invent. The name that started it all was the name that finished it. 2D cartoon animation. 1,229 years. From Romulus to Romulus. From a legend to a footnote. 2D cartoon animation. No trumpets announced the ending. No great battles marked the final chapter. 2D cartoon animation. Just a teenage boy stepping down from a throne that no longer meant anything. 2D cartoon animation. And a world that kept turning, barely noticing that an era had passed. 2D cartoon animation. Sometimes the greatest endings come not with thunder, but with silence. 2D cartoon animation. And sometimes, the fall of an empire is just a boy removing a purple robe and walking away into history. 2D cartoon animation.